Poverty: A Question of Measurement by James Goetti and Michael Struck.
Everyone has a conception of poverty, but people often struggle to define it. We define poverty as a deprivation of the basic capabilities necessary to achieve a minimum standard of well-being that enables an individual to be a credible and dignified member of society. Martha Nussbaum, a pioneer in the capabilities approach of poverty, listed 10 key capabilities. These capabilities include having a life worth living, having good health, being able to move freely and safely, being able to use one's five senses, the ability to feel emotion, having a practical reason, freedom of affiliation, living in relation to other species, being able to enjoy recreation, and having control over one's environment.
Given that poverty is an issue that millions of Americans struggle with every day, it is imperative to determine how poverty ought to be measured in the United States. In order to do this, we advocate for a quasi-relative approach that combines the most beneficial aspects of other approaches while remaining true to our definition of poverty. However, to truly understand why this is the optimal approach, one must first understand the other methods of measuring poverty that our approach draws on. The first, and possibly most integral of these approaches, is known as the capabilities approach. It is based on our aforementioned definition of poverty as a deprivation of capabilities, and seeks to measure these capabilities through a variety of qualitative metrics, such as education level, public health statistics, like life expectancy, quality of life aspects, and social and political factors that affect an individual. This grants the capabilities approach several key strengths, such as allowing for greater nuance and specificity in individual cases. It views poverty as more than simply a lack of income and accounts for additional factors that may influence the well-being of an individual. For example, an individual with a debilitating disease may suffer additional hardships in other capabilities. These are known as corrosive capabilities and are important to understand in measuring poverty. A real-world example of the capabilities approach is the Human Development Index, or HDI. The HDI is used by the United Nations to rate the overall development of a country. It takes three key measures into account: education statistics, life expectancy at birth, and gross national income per capita. It then combines these factors into a numerical index and ranks a country as a decimal between 0 and 1, with 1 being the most developed. Despite its many strengths, the capabilities approach has several key issues that make it impractical as the definitive poverty measure in the United States. Firstly, the individuality of each metric means that data collection for the capabilities approach is tedious and labor-intensive. Secondly, the lack of quantitative metrics makes comparisons challenging, as it is near impossible to compare non-numerical factors such as education level and quality of life between regions. Lastly, the subjectivity of the capabilities approach makes setting a practical poverty threshold for the United States difficult, because it raises such questions as what capabilities ought to be included in the measure, and how should they be weighted relative to each other. Thus, the capabilities approach is not suitable as a national poverty measure in the United States.
Two additional measurements of poverty are the absolute measurement and the relative measurement. Absolute measurements focus on one point of data that measure poverty. They do not make comparisons to others in a specific area. A prime example of an absolute measurement in our modern society is the OPM, or the official poverty measurement. The OPM threshold for poverty is a measured amount of income necessary for basic nutrition multiplied by 3. It is used by the U.S. government to determine who receives welfare benefits. On the other hand, a relative measurement uses a point of data to measure poverty that is relative to what other people in a society have. An example of a relative measurement would be the poverty threshold in which the poverty line would be below the median 50% of income.
Absolute measurements of poverty, such as the OPM, are mainly useful because they are easy to compile and because they are easy to use as points of reference and comparison. The main problems that lie with absolute measurements such as the OPM, however, are that they are blind to others and cannot capture inequality. Additionally, the OPM does not include any in-kind benefits in its measurement. For example, what it means to be impoverished can vary drastically by region in the United States. One below the poverty threshold according to the OPM in a very rural area, such as the Appalachians, might not be necessarily financially struggling and would still be considered a credible member of society. On the other hand, someone below the poverty threshold in an expensive area like San Francisco would still be struggling financially to the point where they could be considered impoverished. They would no longer be considered a credible member of society.
Relative measurements of poverty do a better job of capturing inequalities, for relative measurements of poverty move along with economic fluctuations. However, relative measurements do not capture standards of living or what it means to be a credible member of society. Using the relative measure outlined previously, in a society with an extremely high income, one below the median income or poverty line could still have access to the basic standards of living. On the other hand, one above the median income in an extremely impoverished society with a very low incomes could still not be a credible member of society. It could not have access to the basic standards of living, despite being over the threshold. Conclusively, both measures of poverty do not measure capabilities sufficiently.
As one can see, the three previous approaches to measuring poverty all have their advantages, but also all have serious drawbacks. Thus, it becomes clear why we have chosen the quasi-relative approach to measuring poverty in the United States. The quasi-relative approach combines the best aspects of the three previous measurements by employing metrics that measure capability quantitatively while adjusting for regional differences. This enables the practicality, ease of measurement, and comparability of absolute measures while also accounting for the greater nuance and adaptability of relative measures. It also incorporates the key ideas of the capabilities approach in a practical manner.
In our opinion, the most useful quasi-relative measurement is the SPM. The SPM, or the Supplemental Poverty Measurement, is the 33rd percentile of expenditures from the FCSU. The FCSU stands for Food, Clothing, Shelter, and Utilities. We find the FCSU expenditure to account for the 10 central capabilities that Nussbaum lists that we previously outlined. This measurement, unlike absolute measurements, like the OPM, accounts for geographic regions and in-kind benefits. Unlike many relative measurements, it is not based on just local data, making it more comparable and useful for the nation as a whole. In regards to our initial definition of poverty being the deprivation of one's basic capabilities necessary for well-being, it is prevalent that the quasi-relative measurement, the SPM, is the most efficient way to measure poverty in the United States.